Welcome, everyone. Welcome to my art talk on Rosie Lee Tomkins and the African American tradition of quilt making. My name is Josephine Withers. Many of you have listened to me before. If you're a newcomer, I'll just say a few words about myself. I'm a retired art history professor. I taught for more than 30 years at the University of Maryland in College Park. And I taught mostly courses in contemporary and modern art history and also in feminist history, feminist art history. And I have been living in the Oakland area since let's change the century to 2013. So I'm delighted to be with you today. And as you can see from the title here, I'll be focusing on the artwork of Rosie Lee Tomkins, specifically in the context of a wonderful exhibition right now at the Berkeley Museum, part of the University of California at Berkeley. And if all goes well, and if we're lucky enough, the show will still be up when we're able to go out and visit museums once again. Right now it's scheduled, the show is scheduled to be there through the end of this year, through the end of December. So let's hope that we can actually make it there. So let's begin. So in the first few slides, I'm going to show you some gallery views of the exhibition itself to give you a sense of the scale of the exhibition as well as the scale of her work. You can see from the slide on the left here that some of the works are very large. I would judge that the quilt hanging on the left there is probably some 10 feet tall. So it's a very large quilt piece. And then in another adjoining gallery, you see a number of different scales. Some of these we will see up close in detail in a little while. And then much smaller pieces like these here. And you can see again, two very large pieces like the one here and here, juxtaposed with a much smaller piece. So she worked in a lot of different scales. That's one thing to notice right away. And she was also an amazing colorist, and I'll have much more to say about that. She had a very, very sophisticated sense of color and how to put colors together to maximize the impact. Now here we have a detail, two different details actually of that first slide I showed you, and particularly in the detail on the right-hand side, you can see the rich fabrics that she often used. She loved velvet, and we'll see a number of quilts which incorporate velvet. So let's think for just a moment what velvet does as a material. It not only absorbs color, like the black velvet that you see here on the far right, but it also can reflect color. And you can see in all the wrinkles of this green strips here that is both light absorbing as well as light reflecting. So that adds to the dimension of the color itself. So let's take a little closer look at this wonderful, very large quilt in the exhibition. And I want to point out some of the basic, shall we say, building blocks of quilt making in many African American traditions that she was following. The first is using blocks. So you put together not only squares, but then you put it together as a block. I'm just giving you one example here. Here's another block made up of squares. And then there's other blocks like this one here. Sorry. Like the one that you see here, this block, that are half squares. That's what those triangles are called, half squares. And so she's made several blocks like that. And one of the things that's intriguing about Rosie Lee Tomkins' working habits is that she will turn them around every which way to make those half squares really dance. And then in addition to the squares and the half squares, another basic building block are the strips that you very often see incorporated, sometimes on borders and sometimes in the middle of the piece, like the one that we saw here. These are many, many strips pieced together. Then, in addition to the piecing, which was really her favorite modality, she was less interested in quilting, which means the quilting itself is actually taking the pieced thing to another step, which is putting a backing on it and then using decorative stitches in order to seal the back and the front together with a padding, which of course makes it not only sturdier, but in the case of a utility quilt, it makes it warmer. So, okay, the other element that I want to point out here, in addition to the squares, half squares, the strips, and the blocks, is the embroidery that she has superimposed after she's pieced the whole thing together. And if you look carefully, this is the most legible going up and down the right side there. It's actually a scriptural reference. And as far as I can make out, it's from Luke 3. I think that's either 16 or 66. And I'll have a little bit more to say a little bit later on about what the meaning of these scriptural references are from the New Testament in Rosie Lee Tomkins' life. And occasionally, of course, she has a wonderful sense of humor. For example, this chair, it's like she made a special quilt just for this chair. And so she contoured it so that it would fit and drape very nicely over the back and the seat and so forth. And you'll notice that she's made the whole thing out of men's ties. You see, but then there's also some Christian references, the use of the cross here and other what seemed to be scriptural references that were embroidered on top of the pieced quilt. Now, in this relatively small quilt, you can really see up close other scriptural references as well as many, many crosses, which makes it very clear what her reference point is. So we have the crosses, we have another passage from Luke here, and probably her initials here, which is an E and an F, and I'll have more to say about that in a few moments. And so that was embroidered on top of the piecing. And then appliqued on top of the pieced quilt are these wonderful little decorative pieces, which probably came from the same shop. And I can imagine Rosie Lee Tomkins finding just the right piecing or just the right little piece of fabric to further embellish her quilts. And I know of several stores in the Oakland, Berkeley area that carry embroidered pieces such as you see here. So in other words, she would have bought this ready-made and appliqued it on. And as yet, and you can see in the exhibition itself, you can see that it's even more dimensional because it's kind of thick and padded. So it gives you another kind of dimension when you actually see this piece in the galleries. So now let me tell you a little bit more about Rosie Lee Tomkins. Her real name, or at least her real married name, was Effie Mae Howard. And you see a lovely portrait photograph of her on the right. And it was photographed, as you can see in the label, approximately 1986 by Eli Leon. And I'll have a bit more to say about him in a few moments. But for right now, let's focus on the person known as Effie Mae Howard. She lived in Richmond, California, but she was originally from Arkansas. And it's actually at her mother's knee, quite literally, that she was born in 1936. And she really learned the basics of quilting, especially in the African-American tradition, at her mother's knee, quite literally. And in a moment, I'll be showing you one of her mother's quilts. However, she did not stay in Arkansas. And so in the 50s, she was part of the Great Migration. Perhaps some of you have heard of the Great Migration of African Americans from the Deep South, that is to say, the slaveholding states, that stretched over more than 60 years. And I'm showing you this map to give you a graphic of how that worked. The first of the great migrations was happening during and after the First World War. And they were, especially the people went to the great industrial cities of the North and the Northeast, Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and all the way up to Boston, and especially in the New York area, where there were good manufacturing jobs. The second migration later on between, as you can see here, between 1940 and 1970, that was the part of the Great Migration that Effie Mae Howard participated in. So she went from Arkansas all the way to California, and here in Richmond, of course, right next door to Oakland. Especially during the war, the Second World War, there were great manufacturing jobs, particularly in this area, shipbuilding and munitions for the war effort and so forth. But she came a little bit later than that, but she may well have had friends that preceded her. So that's where she wound up. That's where she married Mr. Howard. And she had 4 children. Actually, a fifth child was even adopted. So for many years after her arrival, she was really busy with her family life, raising her kids and so forth. And it probably wasn't until later in the 70s and beginning of the 80s that she really became much more active with her quilt making. And you can see from this business card that she had made up that she did make, actually, you can see her address there, crazy quilts and pillows of all sizes. So we're thinking that probably she started out with smaller items like pillows and so forth, small crazy quilts. And what we do know is that she made the rounds of various flea markets. I can very well imagine her doing her business at the big flea market near Martin Luther King, and many of you have probably gone or driven by that big flea market that happens on the weekends. But she also was known to have done the flea markets in Marin County and also in Berkeley. And it was through this kind of activity of selling her things in these flea markets that she made the acquaintance of Eli Leon, whom I mentioned a little bit earlier when we saw the portrait photograph of her. So here's Mr. Leon, Mr. Eli Leon, quite a character. Long before he met Rosie Lee Tomkins, which would have been somewhere in the 1980s, maybe early to mid 1980s, he was already a very dedicated and knowledgeable collector of quilts, and specifically African-American quilts. And in this photograph here, you might well think that he's posing with his collection inside of a closet or something in his home, but not at all. His whole house looked pretty much like this, with like one solid storage bin of not only quilts, but quite a few other knickknacks that he had collected over the years. So he really had the collecting bug, but he was also very knowledgeable. And he saw genius when he met up with Rosie Lee Tomkins and was very eager not only to buy her quilts, which he did, but also to promote her. And so they became quite good friends, according to Rosie Lee Tomkins' son. His name is Sammy Howard. And they had a very particular relationship. It's like, you know, they would meet and hang out together. It was kind of a solo affair. It's not like they socialized with other groups or what have you. But to the end of her life, which was, she died in 2006, they were quite good friends. So it was Eli who suggested that because he wanted to promote her, that she needed to get her name out there. And she said, no. She was very shy, introverted person. She didn't want her name out there on the billboard, so to speak. And so the closest that she would come as a humorous gesture, if you will, when Eli Leon wanted to take pictures of her for promotion purposes, was to fashion this photograph here, showing her clothing empty of herself, empty of her new name. And it was because she wanted to hide behind her privacy that the two of them created this new stage name, Rosie Lee Tomkins, which is how we know her, even though we know her real name was Effie Mae Howard. So you can see in so many different ways from just so far we've gone, what a wonderful sense of humor that she had. And I suspect that's yet another thing that Eli Leon appreciated. So now I want to take a closer look at individual quilts. We've seen a little overview so far of the quilts and of her art. And so I want to sort of zero in on some of the distinguishing features of her work. So first, we're going to start with this quilt on the right, but comparing it with this very, very worn out quilt on the left. The quilt on the left was actually made by Rosie Lee Tomkins' mother. And you can see that this was created as a utility quilt. You can imagine it spending many, many years on her bed in Arkansas. And we're very fortunate to have it as part of the Berkeley Museum collection, although you will not see it on view. It's so fragile that it really is not safe to hang on the walls. So we're very lucky to be able to see it here in a slide. And some of the elements, the basic structural elements that I've already pointed out, you can see showing up in Rosie Lee Tomkins' work on the right-hand side. The use of strips and blocks. I don't see any half squares, but there's certainly a lot of squares in this particular quilt, even in the more damaged parts. And in the center is another motif that you will find quite a lot in Rosie Lee Tomkins' work, as well as other African-American quilts. And that is what we call the medallion, the centerpiece. And even though we can't anymore really make out the design there, we can tell that there is a centerpiece there, which is carried over in a smaller way by this large block in the center. We might call that the medallion piece in Rosie Lee Tomkins' work, which is now no longer a utility quilt. And I think it's very interesting to follow up, and I can't give you a definitive answer at this point of when quilts in general were originally intended as utility quilts, either for beds or for wrapping, keeping warm, and when they graduated, so to speak, into another art form and was intended to be hanging from the wall, which is really what this quilt was created for. That's an open-ended question, which I hope to find the answer eventually. It was no doubt a gradual kind of process, but at this point in time, we know that there have been many exhibitions of traditional quilts that have them hanging on the wall as works of art themselves. Now, the headline I've given for this juxtaposition is the title of a book by a very well-known author and scholar of not only African-American textile arts, but also African textile arts. And that is Gladys Marie Fry. I had the honor of knowing her. She taught in the English department at the University of Maryland, so I knew her during my days at the University of Maryland. I'm afraid she's no longer with us. I think she died earlier, 2011, something like that. And this is the title of one of her best known books, Not by the Rules, but by the Heart. Now, as I've already pointed out to you, there are some rules. It's not like higgledy-piggledy, just make it any old way. It's like improvisational music. It starts with certain rules, and I pointed out some of those, like the building blocks we've been talking about, the strips, the blocks, the squares, the half squares, and so forth. But then you go forth from there, using some of those basic building blocks and create by the heart or from the heart. Now, for Rosie Lee Tomkins, what that means of creating by the heart is also channeling spirit. And that was her connection to the Christian faith was very, very important to her. She was a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Richmond. And so that community and the faith that she received from that community was extremely important. And that's one of the things that really shows up in her art most specifically in the scriptural references, which she includes in many of her quilts. But for our delight and our eyes, we also can see the extraordinary level of creativity in her quilts that also can be understood in the connection of her channeling this spirit. Some people would call it intuition, others would call it spirit. She would call it Christ and God. For many of us, they all come to the same thing, but that was extremely important to her work as an artist. Now, I've shown you before some of the humor in her work, and here we have juxtaposed in this, it's not really quite a quilt, it's a hanging, because you can see this one solid piece of fabric here. It's not a pieced quilt at all. And then a detail on the right-hand side. And these wonderful little blobs of color and pattern are called yo-yos. So even the name for these little applique circles that are sort of made like little puff balls and then appliqued on or sewn on have from the very beginning a wonderful sense of humor. And look at the variety of the colors going from purples to yellows to various patterns. And then with her real name, Effie, embroidered on the top, and another Christian reference. And then in all of this, a reference to John, the Gospel of St. John. And what I make out is 3 and maybe verse 16. I'm not sure about that. So she includes a little bit of everything, a wonderful sense of humor, and also a scriptural reference, which for her anyway, really ties it all together. And we've seen this before, but now in a much closer up slide where we can see much more detail. And one of the parallels that I want to make here between, first of all, the use of some of the standard building blocks, but then she plays with them in so many different ways. For example, take, for example, this block with the half squares that are turned in different directions. And the whole thing is kind of creates a whole kind of syncopation. Now think about some of the other great arts of the African American community in this country. You think immediately of jazz, right? You think of dance, whether it's hip hop or more contemporary versions of dance that were initiated by African American artists. And of course, the jazz world would not be anywhere where it is without the African American contributions. And one of the key features of all those other African American art forms is a kind of surprising syncopations and kind of different kinds of rhythms, sometimes triple rhythms interlocking together. So it can get very, very complex. And actually a lot of that kind of syncopation and kind of offbeat work, whether it's textile arts or music, ultimately comes from African traditions. So here we see it, for example, in the very shape of it. Okay, it started out as a square, rectangle with nice straight edges, but no, has curved edges all along. That's not accidental, that's intentional. And the same for many of the blocks. They're just a little bit off of being two regimented squares or rectangles. And so the whole thing is kind of like very lively and full of movement. And look what she has done with color itself in order to enhance that movement. I'm thinking particularly of her use of yellow here, because yellow, being a bright color, tends to look like it comes forward and sort of pushes out, as opposed to the darker colors like the black and the dark purple that tends to recede and go back. So there's kind of that kind of a push-pull effect going on dimensionally. Now, she didn't limit herself to things that hang on the wall either. Here are two wonderful objects there, and there are several more in the exhibition like this. The one on the left, she took just ordinary bottles that had some purpose at some point, and she really dressed them up with various kinds of what I take to be souvenir items, like San Francisco. You see beaded work there, and she would have bought these things or found them in the flea markets. It's not that she made each one of these things. And the shell beads that you see here, you see she's used her initials of her real name, E and F for Effie. And then other kinds of beadwork here. And look how she's personified herself. I seriously doubt that she rode a motorcycle, but here she's certainly making reference to that whole clan and that whole culture. And here on the right, I would assume, what I'm making up is that a lot of these very ornate elements, for example, here, she could have found in an upholstery shop or other kind of a shop that sells materials that are meant for upholstery and interior decoration. I could have easily imagined this on finishing off a fancy Victorian chair, for example. And she's married that with more what looks like Indian beadwork here and other single beads that she's picked up here and there in her travels in the shops and the flea markets. Now, of course, what you're looking at here is actually quite, has its own tradition within the African American quilt tradition. And that is using usually old, discarded, faded denims, which would make a lot of sense from, let's say, a family, a working family where the basic work clothes are jeans that have a certain life, and then they get too ratty, and then they get all cut up and put into a quilt. But I think you can see from the detail here on the right that Rosie Lee Tomkins probably used all new fabrics to create this jeans quilt. And she's made this detail here with the pocket, with its machine embroidery, into the medallion that's more or less in the center of this particular quilt. And so it's worth pointing out here that, and I've suggested it in previous remarks, that she very seldom used, just what's hanging around the house. She was very, very focused and very particular about the fabrics that she used. And so when she got a certain idea of color, contrast or combinations, and also different kinds of fabrics with different textures and feel to them, she would go looking. And so she really scrounged through the fabric shops, the flea markets and so forth of the whole Bay Area to find her materials. So but for the most part, were not just accidentally found objects. And you can see, even with this very close palette, by which I mean it's all blue, because that's what denim is, that's what blue jeans are. She's managed to create a wonderful sense of patterning and movement and sort of different kinds of designs, simply using different values, that is to say, dark to light, because she's not even playing much with any other block than that basic building block of the square and the rectangle. There's no strips and half squares and the rest in this particular quilt. By contrast with the jeans quilt that we just saw, this is another wonderful example of how she could modulate so knowingly, so craftily, according to the type of fabric she was using. Okay, so this is another quilt with a detail on the right-hand side. Now, the thing it has in common with the jeans quilt is that she's chosen to use a very close palette. By that I mean just a very short range of colors, like with the jeans quilt, but unlike some of the other quilts we've looked at with very contrasting colors. So everything is in with the palette of blue to purple, with just a little sprinkling of white in these half squares in here. These are not even white, but rather light blue. But look what she's managed to pull off. Here is, we can call this a strip made up of many different sizes of half squares turned around in different directions, again, to make that sense of movement and sort of scintillation. And then it's best seen in the detail here. She's created these blocks using two different fabrics altogether. What you're looking at here in this half square and throughout is cut velvet, dark purple. So that already has a texture. It reflects and absorbs light in a very different way than the other fabric that she's juxtaposed it with, which I judge to be a printed chintz kind of fabric. And a fabric which is flat in any case, not with a texture like the velvet and the cut velvet. But look what she's managed to pull off with that. Of a sort of, this has sort of a very dark kind of mood to it. You really can talk about mood in this, in the way that she's used very subdued colors and a dark palette, even though she is always playing with her half squares, making them dance for us. Here is yet another way that she introduces sort of dance and movement and scintillation and on the surface. Now this is a quilt, again, with a full quilt on the left and a detail on the right, where she actually did the quilting herself. I think I've mentioned earlier that she was much more interested in the piecing, putting together the top, that is, and less interested in the quilting, which is actually assembling the whole thing with a front and a back with decorative stitching to bind them together. This she would have had to do herself, and what she would have done would be to have the backing and the pieced front, and then pull through from the back the yellow yarn that you see here, which is used not only to secure and to tie the front and the back, but also as a decorative element of the design itself. So on the one hand, you have sort of a two-step kind of design going with the blocks and the strips and all these different elements of the half squares here. And then superimposed on that, because it is dimensional, you see these lively yellow puffballs of yarn, which, and as I've mentioned before, yellow being a very expansive color tends to come forward. So it's literally coming forward in space, and which we could see more easily in the museum itself, as well as being a color that catches our eye and seems to come forward because of its lightness. Now, in contrast, let's take another look here. You see all the incredible contrasts of colors here that depending on which block you are looking at. She's used some of the same building techniques, building blocks here, half squares and made into blocks, again with a full quilt on the left and a detail on the right. This detail shows up, let's see if we can find it, as this one over here with the bar there, okay, got to see that? But she's used entirely different fabrics, almost all of them print fabrics. So that kind of fuzzes up the surface. It doesn't have the sort of the clarity and the geometry of the half squares and the blocks and so forth. So that especially when we look at the whole here, it looks like, you know, like it's, we're looking at it through a fuzz of some sort. One of the images that comes to my mind looking at the full quilt on the left is, imagine yourself in a forest of maple trees. And it's a bright sunny day and you look straight up at the sky through the branches and through the leaves. So you sort of see the pattern and you sort of see the sky, but it all blends into one thing, one whole. And that's sort of what reminds me is I'm reminded of here in this particular quilt. And she's done this completely by totally changing her palette as well as the different kinds of prints rather than the solids. There's hardly any solid blocks or half squares in this particular quilt. Now I've talked quite a bit about in African American music and dance, jazz, etc., about the kind of unexpected rhythm, syncopation, double, triple rhythms. And this is a wonderful example of that, where she starts out giving us the expectation that she's going to create something by the rules. You know, there's going to be straight, rectangular, and then with a big medallion that takes up the whole space, medallion within the medallion. And then she creates a border around it and comes up and says, whoop, nope, I'm not going to close there. I'm going to just go off in another direction. And by now, I trust that you understand that that is very deliberate on her part. It's not some kind of accident. And it adds, to my mind, to the delight and the sort of unexpected qualities of this. Incidentally, she's using velvet once again, and even in the slide, I think you can see this dark green velvet of how it both absorbs as well as reflects light. So it gives it a very distinct kind of pattern to that dark green. Now in the 1990s, some of her quilts really got more into extended stories. And I'm showing this to you. First of all, she has included a very famous prayer attributed to St. Francis. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change those I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And we'll see this same prayer come up in another quilt I'll be showing you momentarily. And then there's other pieces like this where she probably did not do this embroidery. It was pre-embroidered, we might say. And then unexpectedly in this decorative panel, we see what I take to be maybe a football jersey or something like that. The number 55 is a dead giveaway, even though it's upside down. And with the location St. Ignatius, which is a high school in Richmond, California. The part that I make up, because I don't really know this, hasn't been told to me, is this might have been a jersey belonging to one of her sons who played on one of the Richmond teams. That is to say, the team at St. Ignatius. But it also could be a Christian reference because St. Ignatius was a very well-known early Christian saint. And Rosie Lee Tomkins, being so well-versed in Bible history as well as the scriptures itself, I wouldn't be at all surprised that she was using St. Ignatius in at least 2 different ways. Now in this quilt, which you'll see hanging straight on the wall, I'll show another version of it in a few slides from now. But I wanted to show you at least one example that she did finish off herself. And it's been kind of hanging on the wall, but then draped down on the floor so that you can see the part of the back as well, which is finished off with these loops as on the back as well as around the edges of the front. And so what she started out, this is really a complicated quilt, because she started out with a large design which is very well loved in not only African American but also Anglo quilts, and that is the Texas Star or the Star of Texas. That's the motif that we're seeing here, and so that's a pieced quilt. But then on top of that, she has appliqued all these other elements here, there, kind of like a bulletin board, you know, that with all these different separate elements that were stitched onto the finished quilt. And you can see that that idea stretches to the back of the quilt as well, although not as exuberantly decorative as the front. And so here you see another version of the Star of Texas by another African-American quilter, Maddie Pickett. And you can see here, remember I've said before that Rosie Lee Tomkins wasn't much into the quilting part. And this would be typical of many quilters. They would design and piece the front like Mattie Pickett did, but it was quilted by somebody else. And you can see this was quilted by Millie Eddy Graham. And so Millie Eddy Graham was given, important credit, and credit which we can't totally appreciate unless we get to really inspect it, and the kind of design that she stitched into the quilting part. And so it's a very interesting kind of comparison with Rosie Lee Tomkins' version of the Star of Texas. I want to make a little contrast here between the typical Anglo quilt, which I'm showing you just a little, it's actually the cover of a book on colonial quilts. And you'll notice how much more severely geometric many colonial Anglo quilts are compared to the kind of offbeat, syncopated rhythm that I've been emphasizing here, which is so characteristic not only of Rosie Lee Tomkins, but of so many other African-American quilters. So what you're looking at on the right is the same quilt we looked at just a few moments ago, which was draped on the floor so you could see the back, with its many different applique items as well as the quilting itself. And you'll notice that she departs ever so slightly from this more rigid kind of geometry of the Anglo quilts to kind of what we might say mess it up. So it's very clearly a Texas star, but she's kind of playing with it and sort of stepping away from that rigid angular quality, geometrical quality. During the 90s, when I mentioned that she got more into story, this is one of the large quilts, very large quilts from the 90s, where she appliqued in, or this is quilted actually, but from probably one of those souvenir hangings that you can get, 3 of her heroes, Martin Luther King, of course, and then with JFK on the left, and his brother, Robert, on the right-hand side. And so you can see, gazing around the rest of the quilt, that this has a lot to do with patriotism. There's flags everywhere, here and here and here, and different parts of flags, just the stars there, more flags, flags. And then pieced right in there is that a similar kind of patch from the football jersey, St. Ignatius 55, and another reference here. So you can see that that's still with her. And this tells you how big the total quilt is. Here's our St. Francis prayer again, set on its side. And it's reduced to such a small scale, we wouldn't be able to read it, but we can recognize the formatting there. Then, with all this patriotism and rah-rah Americana, we see this quote unquote out of date, out of style kind of material, which first of all is a reproduction of an 18th century tapestry kind of print, which probably would have been reproduced as some kind of either curtain material or wallpaper or upholstery material. So very Anglo, very traditional in the type of style it is, with these damsels and so forth, dancing in the woods, etc. And she's echoed that with another kind of European motif here, with the dancers sort of set on their sides. I would take that as yet another instance of her wonderful sense of humor. So I'm bringing in another element here, and that is the art of Faith Ringgold. Now, I mentioned earlier in our talk today that it's been an interesting journey, for which I do not know all the details of when quilts stopped being just utilitarian things that covered you, kept you warm on the bed or wherever, and slowly became works of art in themselves and are appreciated in art galleries and museums. But there definitely is a trend that became really evident in the 70s and the 1970s and 1980s. And Faith Ringgold, who's a very well-known East Coast artist, she's now in her 90s and African-American. She started her career in the 60s, and she had a very different career path from Rosie Lee Tomkins. And she knew she wanted to be an artist very early, and she went the sort of traditional Western route, going to art school and so forth. And so the first decade of her professional life, she was painting African-American subjects, but she was doing it oil and canvas and, going that path. And it was partly because of the feminist art movement beginning in the 70s that she realized that she was missing out on something that came through her own heritage. And as with Rosie Lee Tomkins and so many of the other quilt makers, her heritage came through her mother. Her mother was a very high-end dressmaker and designer. And so Faith Ringgold learned a lot about pattern and design and color and so forth from her mother. So she began then incorporating a much more traditional, meaning African-American tradition, in her work. And I'm showing you here one of a whole series that she did of quilting bees, where she's incorporating famous male Western artists with traditional figures from her own heritage. And in this particular sunflower quilting bee at Arles, what she wanted to do was to bring together her ancestors, her forebears, around the quilting bee, where they're actually sitting together quilting. This quilt made up of sunflowers. And as a very secondary character, we see Vincent van Gogh holding a bouquet of posies, sort of very much a secondary figure in the background. And if we were able to read, get up close and read, you would know that there's a whole story that goes with this quilt, describing of who these people are and how they came to come together, etc. So it's very interesting how Faith Ringgold has really morphed herself from a Western style artist into an artist who still is very in the Western tradition, but fully incorporates her own African and African-American traditions as well. Now we saw earlier this same green material, which is not quilted or pieced at all. Remember I showed you the yo-yos? It's the same green material. But here she's given that same green material over completely to giving her name, her real name, Effie Mae Howard, and also her date of birth, September 6, 1936 there. That was her birth date. And she's giving various addresses where she's lived and with scriptural references in there as well. And California, so it's kind of like a whole mosaic of her history with references to other members of her family and the various places where she's lived. And all of this is, of course, embroidered on top of the green fabric there. Remember the chair that I showed you earlier? Well, here we see the same neckties or similar neckties used for the purpose of making a wall hanging. And again, showing, I think, her wonderful sense of humor. What I make up is that she could have, when her husband passed, she could have taken his leftover neckties and decided to make a memorial out of them. That wouldn't be the first time that that's happened with an African-American quilter, of taking the belongings, the clothing of a deceased one, and creating recycling in the form of a quilt. This is quite a unique piece, which you'll see in the show, but only one part. This is I guess I'd call it a tunic or coat that she created for herself. And here we're fortunate to see both the back as well as the front, although in the exhibition you'll only see the front because it's, after all, hanging on a wall. But she's using some of the same building blocks that we've seen in the quilts. And yet another element of her very sophisticated design I wanted to bring your attention in this one. She sometimes worked in series. And these two are hanging side by side, as you can see, in the exhibition. And she's using the same palette of colors and the same range of values, by which I mean light to dark. But she's come up with two distinctive designs. And we can see that in both of them, where she has modulated the value as well as the color to create this kind of ghost-like, very irregular form in the middle, almost kind of like a ghost that we might see through the mist or something like that. And then over here, it's a different shape that comes kind of down here and then wanders off to our right on there. But very obviously, she wanted to, it wasn't enough just to make the one, but she was interested in working in series. Certainly she's in a very honored tradition in doing that. Think back in history. Think to Monet. Monet did so much of his later work in series, whether it was water lilies, or whether it was haystacks, or whether it was the cathedral. He used the same motif, but created a totally different and new artwork each time he came back to paint the same motif. So here we see Rosie Lee Tomkins following that same path. I'm going to conclude with this very haunting hanging. It's not exactly a quilt that you'll see towards the end of the exhibition. This was created just a year before her death. So it was 2005, she died in 2006. And it's our judgment that she might have even had a premonition of her own death at that time. If that is so, we can read this as almost like a shroud, where we can imagine it's something to wear, although it's something that does hang on the wall, with a skirt here, and then a bodice up here, which is made up all of yo-yos. No longer so kind of lighthearted and fun-filled like the earlier yo-yo piece that we saw. And of course, the yo-yos here are made of the same fabric, so they don't contrast and stand out like the earlier one. And finally, I want to leave you with at least an open-ended question. I'm here contrasting or comparing one of the quilts, which we've seen a couple of times now, on the left, with the work of another painter who has very little in common with Rosie Lee Tomkins in terms of history or generation or anything else. But what you're looking at on the right is a painting which is also in the Berkeley Permanent Collection by Hans Hofmann. Now, Hans Hofmann was one of the greats of the New York abstract school. He was teacher to actually quite a few of the abstract expressionists. He was originally from Germany, came to this country, and the first place he landed when he got to America as a refugee before the Second World War was UC Berkeley, where he taught for a few years. And he wanted to express his gratitude to the university by making a very large bequest of his paintings. So this is the painting that you see here on the right is one of many, many paintings that are in the permanent collection of UC Berkeley, the museum. And probably many of you have seen these works because they've been featured a number of times at the museum. I'm juxtaposing them here, not because there was any kind of influence back and forth. No, no, no. It's more subtle than that. First of all, I find it no accident that substantial collections of these two works, of these two artists, wound up in the Berkeley Museum, because they do have a lot in common in terms of their overall aesthetics. Both are abstract, and both artists channel their own sources, giving them different names. But for Hans Hofmann, it was intuition. It was very definitely being in the moment and, you know, following his own inner prompts. From Rosie Lee Tomkins, it was her spirit advisors, her Christian belief that really, really inspired her and caused her to say, I owe everything to God. And so I leave you with that idea that there may be other kind of common threads in the 20th century modernist tradition that stretch across a lot of different elements of that tradition. So before I leave you, I want to just suggest some other resources for you if you want to follow up in any way, learn more about either Rosie Lee Tomkins or about African-American quilt making. There's on the Berkeley Museum website, you'll see a wonderful virtual tour of the exhibition, which was given by Lawrence Rindner, who was the former director and also one of the curators for this exhibition. So he's quite knowledgeable. And I also highly recommend this documentary film, The Quilt Makers of Gee's Bend, which is in Alabama. And if you go to PBS website and look up Quilt Makers of Gee's Bend, you'll get right to it. And then two books that I relied on as I was putting this talk together. Wallman's Signs and Symbols, African Images in African-American Quilts. So she makes that connection between Africa and America in many, many different ways. And then finally, our eccentric fellow, Eli Leon, who was the first to really collect Rosie Lee Tomkins' work. He curated an exhibition at the San Francisco Craft and Folk Art Museum. Who'd have thought it? Improvisation in African-American quilt making. And so that's a catalog of an exhibition with essays by him and as well as others. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I certainly enjoyed creating it, and let's hope we all get to see the actual show itself.